Hello, welcome back. So today, everyone, in honor of this shit show of an election season, I think we need to talk about voting. Now, I know what y'all are thinking, but don't get ahead of yourselves. When I say talk about voting, I mean, how can we make the way we vote better? Because y'all, I swear to God, if this happens in 2024, then I'm out, lads. Gone, poof, done. So, to avoid my completely tragic and untimely disappearance in 2024, we're going to talk about 3 of the biggest problems with the way we vote and how we can fix them: voter suppression, the Electoral College, and voting systems. However, as we are all very painfully aware, the Electoral College is basically like an unnecessarily complex band-aid that we have to rip off first. So that's what we're gonna do. I do think we should start by going over some basic history, organization, structure, etc. Especially since in recent weeks, I've been seeing a ton of Electoral College apologia like this. I know, I cringe too, but we're simply moving on. We're moving forward. So with that in mind, part 1, a very short history. So, believe it or not, the Electoral College is actually one of the few particulars of US electoralism that's rooted in the Constitution. There's not many. So this means our girl does indeed have a long history, but she's always been problematic. And I mean, what kind of leftist would we be if we didn't focus on that? To put it super duper simply, the framers of the Constitution thought of the Electoral College as like a federalist compromise. I know, it's super annoying. Basically, the Electoral College was a compromise between a president who was elected by the people, which I don't know, I think we're worthy, and a president chosen by Congress. Can you fucking imagine? I simply cannot. I truly cannot. So technically, some OG Constitutional Convention attendees did stand a direct vote for president, like the James Madison. But like modern day Republicans, they were spineless. So they felt it necessary to compromise with the South. Yikes. So as you're probably aware, enslaved people were denied the right to vote, but they constituted a massive portion of a lot of these southern states' populations. I really want to emphasize that second part because I do think we have a tendency to kind of downplay the physical extent of slavery. It was massive. It was a massive, massive institution. I went through the census data and literally 43% of South Carolina's population was enslaved in 1790. And by 1860, it was up to 57% of the total population. Naturally, as a consequence of a significant portion of southern states' populations being enslaved and denied the right to vote, they realized they would have reduced power in a direct election. So the South, or slave-owning elites, would just absolutely not support a direct vote. But what they would support was the Electoral College. You see, there's another important piece of the puzzle here: the 3/5 compromise. The 3/5 compromise allowed southern states to count 3 of every 5 enslaved people as one person for the purpose of congressional apportionment, or how many seats you're going to end up getting in the House. This matters in this context because the number of electoral votes a state gets is dependent on its representation in Congress. However, because the Founding Fathers were designing the Constitution in what could have been nothing other than an opium-induced haze, they decided to give every state 2 senators regardless of population. So that is always fixed, to this day, even now. I know, moving on. Seats in the House, however, are dependent on population. So the South was actually able to take further advantage of its already enslaved population by counting them towards congressional apportionment for electoral power, while simultaneously denying them the right to vote. Obviously, the 3/5 compromise isn't directly influential on modern day American elections, but we still have an Electoral College. So what's that about? I would really like to know. We'll get more to why that sucks in a minute, but now I want to dive into how the hell the Electoral College even functions. So let's do that. Part 2, how does it even work? So as I hope has become kind of clear at this point, we don't actually directly elect a president. We've already established that each state gets a certain amount of electors, right? And that amount is dependent on its congressional representation. But honestly, whomst the fuck are the electors? Well, first, they're not anyone who holds a federal office, because that is absolutely unconstitutional. Other than that, though, they're chosen by a state's political parties, either at a central committee or at a convention. Each party gets to pick a slate of electors, so that means that they can come from a lot of different places. So shocker, the founding fathers didn't intend this. They actually wanted electors to be independent of partisan connections, but that didn't last long. In theory, we actually do vote on these electors when we vote for president. It's kind of bullshit, but basically if you vote Democrat, you're also putting in a vote for the slate of electors who the Democratic Party chose. In literally almost every state, the electors who get chosen to vote, and thus what votes they cast, are tied to the popular vote. So if you win the popular vote in a state, those electors will generally follow the popular vote, except in Maine and Nebraska. But Maine and Nebraska have collectively 9 electoral votes, so we're just going to ignore them. So ignoring Maine and Nebraska, as one should, here's how it goes down. After Election Day, all the states tally their votes, and they generate something called a certificate of ascertainment, which, contrary to what you might be thinking, is actually not a World of Warcraft scroll. I repeat, this is not an MMO item. So a certificate of ascertainment is basically a document that's sent to a bunch of people, including the National Archivist, that lists out all the votes each elector got. Remember how I said we technically vote on the electors? Yeah, well, a certificate of ascertainment basically just lists the votes for each elector, like a list, and those votes are equivalent to the votes the candidate got. Like, for example, if our girl Jo Jorgensen got 400 votes in the state of Wyoming, the certificate of ascertainment would list Jo Jorgensen's party's electors as each getting 400 votes, because that's how many Jo got. And when you vote for Jo, you vote for her electors. So in this scenario, Jo Jorgensen would actually win the state of Wyoming, because 400 votes in Wyoming is roughly 90% of Wyoming's population. Dad jokes. Okay, but for real, the certificate of ascertainment is actually supposed to represent a very important and tangible link between the electoral vote and the popular vote. But, like, we could also literally just have a popular vote. Anyway, getting ahead of myself. So, the electors never actually meet together nationally. Instead, on that hallowed Monday after the second Sunday in December, they all haul ass to their state capitals to cast their votes. There's a lot of official shit that goes down that doesn't really matter, like taking attendance and stuff, reading out the certificates of ascertainment, whatever. But the important part here at these state capital meetings is that the electors who were chosen to vote, generally based on the popular vote, then cast their ballots for president and vice president separately. Fun fact, electors actually didn't originally vote on the vice president separately. It was just whoever got the second most electoral votes in the presidential election. As you can imagine, this led to situations where the president and vice president were from opposing
political parties,
which literally did happen in 1796 and 1800. And it was not good. It was not good, you guys. So this situation was rectified with the 12th Amendment, but the 12th Amendment is basically the only time the government has ever actually gone through with reforming the structure of the college. Okay, but back to procedure. So the electors meet and they vote, right? And the electors who vote are the ones who were slated to the winning candidate. And in theory, those electors will vote for that candidate. However, this does not always happen. And yeah, most states do have faithless elector laws that bind them to vote for their candidate, but those laws are only actually enforceable kind of in
19 states.
So it's not really a problem, but it's not great. I mean, so after the votes are cast, they're all certified and sent off to a bunch of people again, including this time, the president of the Senate, who is the vice president. All the votes get sorted and prepared for the final boss fight, the joint session of Congress. No, but the joint session of Congress is literally just Congress coming together and giving the official final results of the election. Therefore, they announce the president and vice president, and that's a wrap. This happens after every presidential election on January 6th, with a meeting in the House chamber presided over by the VP, who conveniently sits next to the Speaker of the House. In 2020 terms, this means a stone-faced Mike Pence and Nancy Pelosi presiding over a meeting of stuffy politicians, which is just like an incredibly funny visual to me. Okay, but no, whatever. Each party picks 2 tellers, and those tellers then count the votes for each state and read their certificates of ascertainment. And finally, the VP takes over and officially announces the president and vice president, which is what happened recently with Mike Pence. He did his job and announced the rightful winner of the election. after the votes were counted. So if you don't live under a freaking rock, you may have noticed that this year, or last year, who can keep track, was the year that something very interesting happened at this point in the process. And yes, I am absolutely talking about the very embarrassing for the right attempted Trump coup on the White House that just completely failed, goo goo gaga. But I'm also talking about the objections that were raised. Objections are really the last procedure you need to be familiar with, especially because now they've been used to, attempt to overturn the results of a democratic election. So any dumbass with a congressional office can raise an objection, but those objections are only heard if they're signed off by one House member and one Senate member. So if these requirements are met, then both houses break off and go to vote on said objection. And if both houses vote in the affirmative, that is to throw out the electoral votes, then they're thrown out. But as you can imagine, this doesn't happen often, like very, very rarely in the history of the US. This year, 6 objections were made, but only 2 got the necessary signatures to be heard by both houses. So, because I love to call out a good politician, the first objection was made by the completely Homo sapien Ted Cruz and Paul Gosar, and the second objection was made by Josh Hawley and Scott Perry. Both were resoundingly defeated in both houses, as they should have been. So, in this case, if the votes are a nay, the houses reconvene and the VP announces the winner. And that's a wrap until January 20th, which is the inauguration. So that's basically how it works, which, it's ridiculous, right? It's absolutely very ridiculous. In fact, it's actually more complex than that, but that's really boring to talk about. So instead, let's discuss why it sucks. Part 3, why it sucks. So 61% of Americans actually favor abolishing the Electoral College. And if you're not from here, that's a lot of Americans agreeing on something, you guys. A lot. The first flaw I want to talk about with the Electoral College is probably the most obvious one, which is the fact that it can actually override the national popular vote. Actually, this has happened literally 4 times now, in the elections of 1876, 88, 2000, and 2016. If you're keeping up, that means the past 2 Republican administrations came to power without a plurality of the national vote. Which, interesting. The biggest reason that this happens is because electors per state are not actually perfectly proportionate to a state's population. To start with, all states get 3 electors regardless of population. So some really small states, like Wyoming, have more voting power than bigger states. Essentially, in these states, one electoral vote counts for a lot less people than one electoral vote in a larger state. Literally, in California, one electoral vote counts for
3.6
times as many people as it does in Wyoming. In other words, our system is not really one person, one vote. Some people's votes are more equal than others, which, in my opinion, makes for a pretty crappy democracy. As a result of this, presidential candidates usually just ignore certain states altogether when they campaign because their electoral votes are not really consequential. This is why candidates focus so heavily on swing states and why they're talked about so much. It's literally just because of the Electoral College. Now, yeah, swing states can change as demographics change, but some of them are pretty consistent, especially Pennsylvania and Florida. Those have been swing states for a while. Unfortunately, the swing state business means that the rest of us and our needs aren't focused on by a political campaign, or they're just literally entirely left out. Furthermore, the Electoral College can actually serve to obfuscate voter suppression tactics, like voter ID laws, or like the voter purge that happened in Georgia before the election at the behest of the GOP. This is because a state's electoral vote is always going to be consistent, even if a portion of that population doesn't vote because of indirect disenfranchisement. Meaning that if there's a huge chunk of the population that's not voting, it's not really noticeable because same amount of electors. So, for example, in my very red state, I did go and cast a vote for Joe Biden because, we could not do 4 more years of Trump. But it didn't really matter because it was gonna go red from the beginning. so my vote didn't really count. And that sucks. Now, yeah, most red states are still gonna go red even without the Electoral College. But you at least rest easy knowing that your vote is counted in the final decision-making tally. So I do think this is actually very discouraging to voter turnout too. And honestly, I think without the Electoral College, we'd probably see more people going out to the polls because they would feel like their vote matters. Another big problem with the whole system, you guys, is that it is too damn complicated. Way too complicated. So even after all of my research for this video, I still don't fully understand the mechanics of how the Electoral College functions. And that's a problem. Like, maybe this is a hot take, but I don't think you should need a political science degree to understand how a presidential election works in your country, at least not on a basic level. If our elections are not transparent and people don't understand how they work, it makes them that much easier to subvert, like what Trump tried to do recently.
So, look, all I want to do is this. I just want to find 11,780 votes.
I mean, if people already don't understand how the electoral system works, is it really that much of a stretch to buy into outrageous voter fraud claims? I don't think so. It kind of makes sense. I mean, I'm not like justifying it, it's still literally ridiculous, but I do think it's related. All this sounds really bad, right? Like, it's not looking good for the Electoral College. And that's because it is bad. And I mean, this is not really news. There have been over 700 attempted amendments to either modify or just outright abolish the Electoral College, but they've all failed, besides the 12th Amendment. Not to mention, with like how large and partisan our country is now, I don't think we're ever going to pass another constitutional amendment. Like, we're just simply not. So what do we do? Well, I am pleased to introduce you to a little lady called the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, or npvic for short. If a state passes this compact, it means that it will no longer award electoral votes to the state popular winner, but instead to the national popular winner. If we can get enough states to pass npvic and therefore get it to add up to 270 electoral votes, we've essentially abolished the Electoral College, right? Like, we just bypass it. Currently, it's 73% of the way there, and 15 states have already passed it, so it's kind of popular. I mean, unless you're an entrenched politician who relies on anti-democratic institutions to maintain your hold on power, but I don't know anyone like that in this country. Had npvic been passed a long time ago, we would have never had a Bush administration in 2000, probably not a Bush administration in 2004, and no Trump administration in 2016. So, if npvic comes on your state ballot, vote for it. Vote yes, because it is probably the only chance we have right now at making our elections more democratic. Again, you guys, I do not want to see this or this crawl out of their respective lizard holes, no offense to lizards, and become president without even getting a plurality of the national vote. Oh, speaking of plurality voting, yeah, it sucks too. However, I'm absolutely getting ahead of myself, and we will be talking about plurality voting in the next video. I mean, you guys, there is a time limit to how long I can talk about the mechanics of US electoralism without, like, I don't know, frankly, something bad happening to me. On that note, TTYL, comment, like, subscribe, and I will see you in the next video. No, like, that's it. Like, go. Like, we're done.